Chronic weaknesses in law enforcement allow modern slavery to thrive in the UK. In his first report, the Commissioner says substandard crime reporting is allowing organised crime to act with impunity.
It's horrendous. You could have a neighbour who has someone against their will, working as a domestic servitude, working as a sex slave, right next to you, and you wouldn't know.
Also this lunchtime, 27 years for cafe owner John Leatham, who murdered teenager Paige Doherty, who was looking for a job. Corbyn says the government has no answers on Brexit. May says she wants maximum access to the single market with controlled immigration. And urgent calls for more parents of newborns to sign up their babies to the organ transplant register.
This is the ITV Lunchtime News with Alistair Stewart.
Good afternoon. Substandard crime reporting and chronic weaknesses in law enforcement have meant modern slavery is still a scourge in the United Kingdom. That's the conclusion of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, Kevin Hyland, in his first annual report. More than 3,000 cases were referred, but fewer than 900 crimes were reported. Examples range from domestic workers shipped in and kept in servitude to young women trafficked into the sex industry. The National Police Chiefs Council said modern slavery was a vile crime, but claimed its prosecution is unique and complex. I'll be talking to the Commissioner in a moment, but first this from Richard Pallow.
In Britain, right now, there are an estimated 12,000 slaves. This woman, who we're calling Crystal, was trying to escape an abusive marriage in Trinidad. Instead, she was tricked into a life of domestic servitude for an affluent family in Hertfordshire. 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 4 years.
I was then trafficked to a Nigerian family, and I was then given the orders that they had bought me and that I would be their slave. I was just so scared of these people, and they knew when my kids were back home. And one of the things they always do is they would always threaten you. Don't try to run away, we own you.
In the past year, more than 3,000 people were referred to the Home Office as potential victims of slavery. But police in England and Wales recorded only 884 of them as crimes. And a new report says that until their response dramatically improves, victims both now and in the future are being failed. Despite the Modern Slavery Act being introduced here last year, the new figures show that effectively 3 in every 4 incidents are not being properly investigated, the framework between the police and the Home Office failing too often. The vulnerable exploited in brothels, factories, agriculture and private homes.
Slavery's closer than you think.
I also think it's very hard for the police to do their job when victims aren't properly supported. In order to get a criminal conviction, you clearly need witnesses. And if the witnesses aren't properly supported, they're not going to feel safe to come forward and give the evidence that the police need.
As if to illustrate, it took the Home Office 7 years to recognise what Crystal had endured as a crime.
It's horrendous. You could have a neighbour who has someone against their will, working as a domestic servitude, working as a sex slave, right next to you, and you wouldn't know.
And still, in too many cases, neither do the authorities. Richard Pallow, ITV News.
And Kevin Hyland is the UK's independent anti-slavery commissioner who wrote the report. I'm delighted to say that he joins me live now. Thanks, Mr. Hyland. Let me take you straight to that case of Crystal there that Richard reported on. 7 years before the Home Office confirmed that she was indeed a victim of slavery. Why does it take so long?
Well, these are the issues that I raise in my report. I need to see that the agencies that are responsible for responding to these crimes do so. The access for victims is easy and consistent across the UK. And when these crimes are identified, there is action taken. Because whilst there is no action, there will be no confidence in these crimes. There has been a lot done. We are seeing achievements. We are seeing more prosecutions and a 40% rise in victims coming forward. But I want to see a lot more done. I want to see these criminals actually end up where they belong, in prison.
And you point the finger very clearly in the report to a number, but not all, of police forces.
Well, across the United Kingdom, we see police forces who are acting well and convicting people. We do see an improvement generally across the UK, but I want to see a far more coordinated approach. These are criminals who operate very often with impunity. We need to work more with countries of origin where victims are sourced from, and we need to turn it on the risks are to the criminals, and there are no profits, because at the moment this is high profit and very little risk.
You have this job because the former Home Secretary, now Prime Minister, Theresa May, made this an absolute priority. Are you calling on her to read the Riot Act to certain folk today?
Well, as we've seen, the Prime Minister has taken this very seriously and has raised it as a priority. And in fact, in the last month, raised this at the United Nations and is calling on all United Nations member states, the 193 member states, to have this as a priority and to follow through one of the Sustainable Development Goals, which was led by the United Kingdom. So the Prime Minister is already doing that, but I think what we need to see is action by all the agencies who are responsible, and we need to see that victims are supported. So I want to see that the referral mechanism meets their needs, but then that policing and law enforcement agencies pursue these who commit these serious crimes.
Mr. Hyland, we're grateful for your time. Thank you. A man who stabbed a schoolgirl to death in his shop has been jailed for 27 years. John Leatham pleaded guilty to murdering 15-year-old Paige Doherty in March in West Dunbartonshire. She was looking for a job. The judge said the murder was impossible to comprehend. Paige's mother said the world was rid of an evil man. Our Scotland correspondent Peter Smith was in court for sentencing.
Paige Doherty was going to her Saturday job at a hairdresser's when she was murdered. The schoolgirl can be seen here on CCTV going into her local deli that March morning. These are the last pictures of Paige Doherty still alive. Inside, she was killed in a frenzied attack by the deli owner, John Leatham. He stabbed and slashed Paige at least 146 times. Pathologists said it was difficult to count the wounds. Today, Leatham was sentenced to 27 years in prison, and Paige's family were there to see justice.
There is no sentence high enough to justify what has happened, but we can now say there is one less evil man in this world, which then makes the world that bit more safe for our kids to grow up in. Paige is now safe and can finally rest in peace knowing justice has been served to a high standard.
John Leatham has no history of violence, but the CCTV footage from that day shows how he tried to cover the crime. 10 minutes after Paige went in, the shop shutter was pulled down. Leatham moved his car outside the deli and bought bin bags and antibacterial wipes. Paige's body was found dumped next to a main road. Cameras were allowed in court today to hear Leatham being sentenced.
What you did was truly reprehensible. It is impossible to comprehend how an apparently happily married man with a young child who's running a successful business is capable of such an horrific level of violence.
John Leatham was then led away to begin his sentence, and there was a furious reaction inside the packed courtroom. Friends and family of Paige screamed out, "Beast, monster," at John Leatham. One woman leaned over the dock and simply asked, "Why did you do this?" Leatham claimed he killed Paige because she threatened to accuse him of touching her unless he gave her a job. Today the judge completely rejected that explanation. Now Paige's family know who killed their little girl and how, but they still don't know why. Peter Smith, ITV News, Glasgow.
Brexit and whether Parliament will get a vote on it dominated Prime Minister's questions in Westminster today. The Labour leader accused the government of having no strategy to leave and said the Prime Minister had changed tack but still didn't have answers to the big questions. She insisted Britain will negotiate the best deal, the maximum possible access to the single market with the control of the free movement of people. Well, our political correspondent Paul Brand is live at Westminster for us this lunchtime and saw it all. So are we any closer to knowing the precise detail of Brexit?
Well, Alistair, Labour's big complaint today is that if the government does know what Brexit looks like, it is not telling MPs. and it's certainly, I'm afraid, not telling us either. There was an interesting hint, though, today in Prime Minister's questions. The Prime Minister was asked repeatedly by Jeremy Corbyn, will we be staying in the single market? In other words, will we keep the same trading relationship and rules as we currently have with the EU, which some businesses feel is key to our economy? And on that, she gave this interesting hint during this exchange that she doesn't think staying in the single market is necessarily the starting point of her negotiations.
Someone once said that leaving the single market would risk a loss of investors and business, and we risk going backwards when it comes to international trade. That person is now the Prime Minister, and that was before the referendums. Yes. What reassurance can she give to workers today desperately worried about their future, their company and their jobs?
He doesn't seem to get what the future is going to be about. The UK will be leaving the European Union. We're not asking ourselves what bits of membership we want to retain. We're saying what is the right relationship for the UK to have to the maximum benefit of our economy and citizens of this country.
But Labour are continuing to search for answers as we speak, Paul.
Yeah, 170 answers to be precise. They've sent 170 questions to the government, which they say needs answering on Brexit, including 16 questions on trade, 15 on immigration and others on employment rights, EU funding and farming. They are bound to come up and are already coming up during a debate this afternoon in the Commons. Labour wants more scrutiny by MPs. The government, though, says they can have a say, just not a final say. There will be no vote.
Paul, thank you. Help for children in England who are at risk and vulnerable is still inconsistent and unsatisfactory, according to the National Spending Watchdog. In assessing the government's progress in child protection over the years, the National Audit Office found children's services were poor, with 3/4 of local authority services deemed inadequate or needing to improve. Sally Lockwood has more.
Every time a child known to social services is killed, there's anger, outrage and promises of lessons learned. But 6 years after the government vowed to take action to keep children safe, services have got worse. Ellie Butler was put back in the care of her parents after her father was cleared of abusing her. But just 11 months later, Ben Butler murdered his 6-year-old daughter, who was found with catastrophic injuries. Ellie's grandparents fought a 5-year legal battle to keep Ellie in their care, but their concerns for her safety were ignored.
If the whole of the system, the education, the social services, the state and the judiciary had done more to help Ellie and protect Ellie, she would be here today, living with her nan and her granddad, and she'd be loved. But they all failed her. Everybody in that system failed her.
The number of serious cases in England has risen by 124% in the past 10 years, where a local authority believes a child may be suffering or likely to suffer significant harm. But despite annual spending of £1.8 billion on children's social work, more than 75% of local authority child protection services were found to be inadequate or requiring improvement.
People are flagging the problems. I think it's the action and response that people are then saying, what can we do? What are our assessments? What are the risk factors? And what are the action? And they're not taking those action well enough, consistently across the board.
The system has already failed far too many children. These latest figures show it's also failing to improve. Sally Lockwood, ITV News.
Still to come this lunchtime, 50 years of friendship, the enduring bonds that were formed from one of Britain's biggest tragedies. But first, a 5-month-old baby's become Britain's youngest double lung transplant patient. Imogen Bolton's tiny lungs couldn't form properly because of a rare illness. But luckily, earlier this year, a donor was found. Weighing only 10 pounds, Imogen survived a 7-hour operation, which saved her life. Olivia Kinsley has the story.
In her first months, Imogen Bolton was desperately ill. Tiny and frail, she was in and out of hospital with a rare condition which left her struggling to breathe. Today, it's an astounding transformation. She has 2 new lungs which were transplanted when she was just 5 months old, the youngest double recipient in Britain and possibly Europe.
I don't think there are any words. Thank you isn't enough. I spent 2 days after a transplant crying consistently because, and I say it and I still say it, it could have so easily have been me. It could have been me that lost my child.
Children can wait years for a donor. In some cases, it never comes. Imogen was incredibly lucky. Her match came up within days. Then it was a complex operation.
They have to use magnifying glasses. They're looking at very tiny little lungs. If you think about the airways that are attached, they're about the size of a small straw. So stitching those in and making sure that they're stitched well without problems of leaking.
Imogen's now home and apparently healthy, but her parents are very aware that for Imogen to get her donor lungs, another family lost a child.
What they need to know is that part of their child does live on in Imogen, and her happiness and her brightness is what you can see shines through, not just from one child but from 2 now.
They've played a part in the progress of medicine, and that may help to save more babies' lives. Olivia Kinsley, ITV News.
And Imogen was one of the lucky few to receive an organ from another baby. A lot don't, because there aren't enough babies and young children signed up to the National Organ Donors Register. Currently in the UK, there are 150 patients under the age of 18 on the waiting list for organ transplants. 34 of those need a heart or lung transplant, or both. But between 2014 and 15, 11 children died whilst waiting for an organ transplant. Well, joining me now in the studio is Dee Lothian and her lovely daughter, Tiffany. Tiffany, right there now. She had a liver transplant when she was just 6 months old. Also with us, Sally Johnson, who's the NHS's Director of Organ Donation and Transplant. We've bonded very, very well indeed. A nightmare period for you, absolutely. Waiting and waiting until another member of the family finally solved the problem.
Yeah, unfortunately, Tiffany really took a turn for the worst in quite a short space of time. But because of the lack of donors, we were running out of time and we was running out of options.
How poorly was she?
She was very sick. She was dying. And, you know, there was nobody available for her. There was no organs available for her. And thankfully, a member of our family was suitable to become a live donor for her. There's very strict guidelines on weight and blood groups, which stipulates what organ you can have. And we were essentially waiting for a small child to pass away.
A small child who's so fit as a fiddle points across the studio when she sees herself on television. Yeah. Yes, that is you, darling. Tough decision to sign that card. Oh, absolutely. I've got 4 children, and even to ask them going through the process myself is very difficult. But it's you have to think about the other side of it. Yeah. There's another family there somewhere struggling, waiting for an organ that could give a lot of hope. Absolutely. And Sally, you've got the card. I have. Hold it up and the cameraman will find it. Yes, I donate. But as we've just heard, that's a really tough question to ask to a young mum, very often a young couple, of course, at the peak of their emotions.
It's an unbelievably tough decision to make. But all the donor families I've met, and particularly mothers of young children, will say to me, you know, the worst has already happened. I've just been told that my child has died.
But medically, does it have to be a young child? Because sitting next to you is life from an adult donor.
Well, sometimes for livers and kidneys, an adult can give to a child. But if you think about hearts and lungs, it has to be a child, because you can't fit them in the chest otherwise. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both very much indeed. A real pleasure to meet you, Tiffany. Thank you very much for letting Mum bring you in. Thank you all very much. For information on how you can sign your child up to be an organ donor, just go to our website, itv.com/news. Finally, in the 50 years since the Aberfan disaster, some of the mothers who lost children that devastating day have found a way to come together and cope with their grief. They call themselves the Young Wives Club and have met without fail every week for the last half a century. It was October 1966 when a coal tip collapsed onto a school in a Welsh village, killing 116 children and 28 adults. Reba Evelyn reports now on how the women of that community have coped since.
Amongst these women there is an unspoken bond, a shared loss that binds this extraordinary group together. The Aberfan Young Wives Club meet weekly, and while 50 years on they can enjoy life, it is always against the backdrop of an appalling catastrophe. 116 children and 28 adults died on the 21st of October 1966. They were mostly buried inside Pantglas Junior School when 150,000 tonnes of water-saturated debris from a colliery spoil tip slid down the hill and into the village.
My husband, he was up there again. You were just praying that she'd come out.
Pat Lee's daughter Anne was one of the missing, but like so many that day, she would not be found alive.
It's hard to explain, to be honest, how you feel if you suddenly you're an 8-year-old child who's beautiful. She's gone. I'm sorry. It was a nightmare then, really, then.
The magnitude and horror of that day reached into almost every home. A generation of classmates buried side by side. The young wives began meeting a few months later.
I didn't want to go. And I went. And I never missed after that. Because it was somewhere where everybody was there, but nobody spoke of the disaster. No talking about children or bereavements. It was different. I think it was good for everybody.
The Young Wives Club has, with the passage of time, renamed itself the Wives Club. But while the decades have passed, the loss remains, and week after week, this unofficial support group has been a cornerstone in the lives of so many affected by Aberfan. Rupert Evelyn, ITV News.
The full documentary, The Aberfan Young Wives Club, is on ITV tonight at 9 o'clock. That's it from us for now. The ITV Lunchtime News says a very good afternoon to you. Bye-bye.